what happened after that. If you know your Scottish history, it's another key things that happened.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks so much for all the answers to those questions, Linda. I think we're going to have to move on now. So, we're now going to have our panel on Scottish historical fiction. So if I can ask the panel members to join us. We've got Flora Johnston, who wrote What You Call Free, and Rob McInroy, who wrote Cuddy's Strip. So if I can pass over for you to give a bit of an introduction of yourselves and how you relate to Scottish historical fiction. If Flora, you want to start us off?
Yep, I'm glad to. So my book is What You Call Free, and it was published in March, and it was my first novel, but I've been working in Scottish history for over 20 years, working in museums and exhibitions and things like that. But yeah, I really enjoyed moving from that and taking that into fiction. And What You Call Free is the story of two real 17th century women who both came up against the powers of the day in one way or another.
Great, thank you. And Rob, if you could tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, hello. My name's Rob McInroy, and I'm the author of Cuddy's Strip, which is a historical novel based on true crimes that happened in Perth in 1935. And I have to be honest, I never actually set out to be a historical novelist. I was already writing a series of novels which was set in 1985, which is in the past, but I would hate to say it was a historical novel because I remember it so well. So not officially a historical novel. But then I came across the story of Cuddy's Strip completely by chance. And I was so intrigued and engaged by the story behind it that I stopped what I was doing on my existing series and really concentrated on this writing up Cuddy's Strip. And once I'd done that, once I'd finished it, I realised that I had a series on my hand featuring Bob Kelty, who's the young detective in the story. So I wrote a second novel, and that called Barossa Street, and that will be coming out in the springtime. And I'm currently writing a third in the series, and I've got ideas for possibly another 3 or 4, which will take us up to about 1963. So I kind of came into this by accident, but really enjoying it.
Brilliant, thank you. So again, make sure you put any questions you've got for the panel in the chat or in the Q&A box. And again, I'll just get the ball rolling by asking a bit of a question again. So you're all writing about issues that happened in the past, with Ray's Dragon in the early 14th century, What You Call Free in the 17th century, and Cuddy's Strip in the 1930s. How do you make those stories relevant today and pick out that issue that's, you know, resonates with modern readers? And is that something you go into it that you're conscious of at the very beginning? Whoever would like to start off.
Shall I kick off with that? Yeah, so as I said, Cuddy's Strip, it's based on a true crime that happened in Perth in the 1930s. But although it's a historical novel and it's historical facts, it still deals with contemporary issues. And that's something that Val McDermid specifically pointed out. She recommended the book at the Edinburgh International Book Festival earlier this year. And she pointed out how contemporary it was, even though it was dealing with historical record. Because the novel, it deals with matters of misogyny, poor police practice, and basically the way that the whole legal system treats women in a very, very shabby manner. And all of those, sadly, are massively relevant still today. So I think Cuddy's Strip shows that, well, we've come a long way in the last 85 years, but it does present a fairly uncomfortable truth that there's still a long way to go. Women who are caught up in the judicial system today still go through a lot of difficulty. And then just thinking a bit wider than that, looking at the society of the time, that's what really intrigued me as well, because I can see strong resonances with the 1930s, the end of the 1930s, and today. And I think there's quite an increase in interest in that period. And I think it's probably because we're in danger of making the same mistakes we made then again. And we know what happened in 1939 because of those mistakes. So in that period, in the mid-30s, the fascist regime in Germany was beginning to show its true colours, its true evil nature was coming to the fore. It had turned on gypsies, homosexuals, Catholics, and of course, Jews. And there was a lot of disquiet about it internationally, but no one really spoke up that much. We had the League of Nations. It demonstrated its weakness in the face of Mussolini and Hitler, and it didn't really get involved in anything about Franco's civil war in Spain. So it was a period of pernicious populism and petty nationalism and vilification of foreigners. And sadly, that last sentence is very, very resonant today, because we see the same things, certainly in this country and also through the rest of Europe as well. And I'm currently writing the third book in the series, and we've moved up now to 1939, so the very eve of war. And in the country at that point, there was a real sense of resignation. This is only going to end one way. It's going to end in war. It was the culmination of years of appeasement, people trying to sweep things under the carpet, trying to pretend things weren't as bad as they are. And you can see that again now. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have the COP26 conference in Glasgow. And all the leaders of the world, well, apart from China, maybe, all of the leaders of the world are going to come and they'll pay lip service to climate change, and they're going to pretend that they're all dealing with it. And at the end of it, they'll come up with some trite declaration with a few weak promises, and they'll re-pledge a few £billion that they've already told us they were going to invest half a dozen times before. But lots of photo opportunities for them. And then they'll all go back to their gilded palaces and carry on exactly as they did before. And the planet will continue to fall into ruin because we never learn. And I think that for me, that's why historical fiction is so important.
Yeah, what strikes me as Rob is speaking is, despite the fact our books are set several centuries apart, there are a few of the themes that Rob's talking about there that I was very aware of while I was writing What You Call Free as well. You know, what people do when they get power, how they treat other people, how we treat women in society, what happens to a society that has become very divided. But I think for me, in writing historical fiction, that's all there while you're thinking about it and developing it. But I don't want to kind of put it in too strongly. You know, it's not the purpose for writing the book. It's there as part of it. But I very much believe that different readers coming to it with their own perspectives will find and do find relevance in a lot of historical fiction, and I'm sure in both the books that Linda and Rob have written as well, because the same themes, as you say, come out again and again, just in different forms.
Okay. I mean, to be honest, I didn't start writing this to make my books to make it any messages and make any points. You just find you naturally do that. And when you're writing a book set in the 14th century, when you were born and brought up in the 21st, you kind of put onto it some of the values and opinions that are current here. So you kind of do, I always did that subconsciously. So I didn't write it with any polemic background intended. I wanted to be as factual as I could. I wanted to talk about human frailties, and probably I have taken them from this century rather than the 14th century. But I did want to write something that was entertaining. So whilst I have got lots of themes around independence and about oppression and about exploitation and tyranny, there are some little sound bites about politically what's happening up here now, and lack of democracy and stuff like that. So that comes in, I think, because the book is a reflection of the person that's written it. So it'd be very difficult, I think, for anyone to write a book that had some of them in them, set some of them in the book. So I think there are definitely things that have sort of seeped into it, but it certainly wasn't my intention to write anything that had a political message. So, but I think that happens as part of the writing, because you're writing about something you care about, as I explained when I started this evening.
Great, thank you. I'd like to ask, what excites you about writing Scottish historical fiction today? For anyone that wants to jump in.
Right, go again.
Sorry, go on, Rob.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think there's a very long literary tradition in Scotland. It probably goes right back to the Scottish Enlightenment and even before that. But it does feel to me that the Scottish literary scene at the moment is particularly vibrant. There's a lot of stuff going on. And I don't know if that's a response to the ongoing debate we've got in Scottish society about what Scotland's future is going to be. Are we going to be an independent nation? Are we still going to be part of the Union? Are we going to be in Europe? Are we out of Europe? And it's just interesting to follow that debate at a time when Scotland is kind of being dragged, because of its membership of the Union, into this kind of inwardly focused and populist mind frame, because that's not something that Scotland has traditionally been. It's not been the Scottish way. Scotland has always been a bit of an internationalist country and outward looking. So that tension, I think, is going to grow and grow. And at some point, something is going to have to give. So for me as a writer, I just think it's really interesting to explore the nature of Scottishness through examining our history and trying to set that in the context of our current times. Because I just get the feeling the next 5 years or so is going to be really, really pivotal for Scotland and the way it goes forward in future.
I suppose I agree with Rob in his assessment. I also think for a country that has, always been a small country, we've punched above our weight throughout the centuries, and we've had to, there's always been an undertone of Scotland was a poor country that got saved by the various people who've come to either invade or to fight with Scotland in the over the centuries. And I think that has created a culture that has got a lot of integrity, has a lot of culture. We had 4 universities when England had 2, and we were still a very small country. St Andrews and Glasgow and Edinburgh were universities, as I think Oxford and Cambridge. We did punch above our weight. We valued education. We valued the ability, and there was a religious aspect that we wanted everybody to be able to read the Bible rather than accept what people told them. So again, I think there's some cultural things that are very important that make Scottish history very interesting. And as I say, we were at the heart of a lot of stuff that was happening at the time I've written. Certainly in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, we were at the heart of that because we had a lot of time to think about stuff, and we had the education. People were educated. As a greater percentage, I'm not saying it was, we were all, reading and writing like the best of them, but we certainly had a high proportion of people who weren't going to accept the lot and who could bring a lot to the Union and the Empire, and what's subsequently happened in the 18th and 19th century. So I think there's a lot. Scottish history is very interesting for that reason, and there's a lot to write about, and there's a lot of things that happen, and we had a big influence on what was happening in not just Scotland and the United Kingdom, but also in Europe.
Yeah, and I think there is just such richness. There are so many stories and so many layers of stories in the centuries of Scotland's past, and that would be the same for any country. But I just get fascinated by people's lives, by stories, by how they connect with today and with the place of Scotland. So it just feels to me there is so much to explore there, that and to question as well. There are good parts in our past and there are bad parts in our past, and there's a lot that we can explore. So yeah, there's any amount of material, that's for sure.
Great, thank you. On the flip side then, what do you think the main challenges are to writing Scottish historical fiction? Again, for anybody that would want to jump in first.
Well, I guess doing historical fiction, I would say one of the main challenges is you have to do so much research, and then you have to work out how that research actually gets into your book. Because to know the period and really to be able to write within it, you have to do loads of research, and there is therefore a temptation to kind of share all that knowledge with the reader, which they maybe don't really want because they weren't planning to read a history book. But at the same time, you know, you want them to get a sense of depth and why things happened. So for me, I would say that is constantly the challenge, is disappearing off down a research rabbit hole and finding out lots of fascinating information, and then working out actually how is that going to go in the story and inform the story in a way that doesn't overload it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's really important. Trying to bring in enough historical detail to draw the reader into the story without boring them. And I think Linda does that absolutely brilliantly in her book, because there's an incredible array of different settings in the book. We're in the courts of the kings of Scotland and France and England and the Byzantium Empire. And we've got the Crusades in there, we've got the Wars of Scottish Independence, we've got rioting in France. And you have to assume that people like me, readers, we haven't got any real knowledge of that. So somehow or other, you've got to bring that detail in without it becoming turgid and kind of dull. And I think Linda does a brilliant job in sketching that historical background while still driving the narrative forward at a really tremendous pace. So I think that's really important. And I think another thing for me is, it's something that we've already picked up on already, is trying not too much to let the thoughts and beliefs of today affect the narrative. I mean, what's happening in the past is really important, but we have to understand that people thought differently in the past, and they had different beliefs and different understandings and moral codes, and somehow or other we have to reflect that. So we've already talked about women, and the role of women in the past is highly problematic for us nowadays. So it becomes then a matter of how we invest some agency in those female characters. And I think for me, too often in books and in films in particular, it's done in a kind of a superficial way, almost a bit of a cartoonish way. The woman suddenly acts or speaks in a way that simply wouldn't have been tolerated in those times. And I think that's something that Flora does brilliantly in What You Call Free. The story revolves around two women characters, and we see them growing in stature throughout the novel, but it's done in a very realistic and a very contemporaneous way. We've got Jonnet, for example. Now Jonnet suffers the double misfortune of being born female and poor in a society that privileges wealth and testicles. And she literally has no voice. She's forced into this flea-ridden sackcloth week after week and made to sit in silence in church as her peers judge her moral weakness and failures. And we've got the other character as Helen. She's in a much stronger social position, but she too is forced into silence in the novel in a really very violent way. So there's no great speech from them about rising above their situation and throwing off the shackles, and no sort of Hollywood right-on moment about woman power and stuff like that. But still quietly, through the strength of the characters of these two women, that's exactly what Jonnet and Helen do. And I just think it's absolutely brilliantly written. So I think those are two really difficult things to pull off, you know, that trying to write about the mores of the time and trying to bring reality to your story without overloading it. And I think both Flora and Linda do that really, really well.
I mean, the things I've found difficult, luckily within the sort of time frame I was writing about, there was some quite strong female characters. In fact, the heiress to the Kingdom of Scotland was a Norwegian princess. Unfortunately, she died on the way to Scotland, but it was really her death that set many things off. It was her she died in Orkney, and when she was 7 years old, and she was the only heir. So, you know, there's, so say, female characters are difficult in historical fiction, but I was quite lucky with having someone like her, even though she was quite young when she died. The impact her death had was quite monumental on Scotland and the relationship with England. And there's another very strong female character that I start to talk about in the book, but she comes later, and of course she married the King of England, Edward II, and she murdered him. So she had she was a strong character, and she was the only survivor of King Philip of France's children, and her children went on to be, King Edward III. And as I say, the 100 Years' War was a result of her son's claim to the French throne. So trying not to repeat, I guess, was the other thing I try not to do, is, or plagiarize stuff that had already been written about Scotland, and trying not to be cliched. So, I think Rob, not too much tartan and shortbread, In my period of time, there isn't that, but not bagpipes in the background as they're marching into battle and that sort of stuff. So, just keeping it relevant to the Scottish themes, but not being a cliche.
Brilliant, thank you. We've had a few questions come through in the chat. So Ben has asked, when writing your books, did it help to visit any of the locations that were part of significant events in your stories?
Yes. You get an atmosphere. Yes. Quite a lot of the places so a few weekends I dragged my cousin over to Glasgow Cathedral, even though I'd finished the book by then. An amazing place. You hear about St Giles, but you don't hear about Glasgow Cathedral. I'd suggest everyone strongly goes and visits it. It's an amazing place, and Bishop Worship's buried there. So maybe I would have. Now I know, and I get a little sense of who he was a bit more, because he obviously walked around the place, and I've been there before years ago, but it was good to go back. And I've visited France many times, and I've been to Istanbul and Constantinople, and travelled around there. So it does help, because you get a sense of what they saw, because you're seeing what they saw in many places. Some of these buildings have never been changed, so you get a sense of proportion. You get a sense of what it might have been like for them, and you supplement that with other books, and you make up stuff. Don't get me wrong, you do make up stuff. I talk about when Philip of France is sitting wondering about what he's going to do. He's in Sainte-Chapelle, and I've been there. It's an amazing place. It's like a reliquary, and they used it to host the Crown of Thorns, and it's built like a kaleidoscope of glass and light, and as I say, like a reliquary. And so it's good. It helps your description to go and visit these places. So my experience has been, yes, if you can, and it's not imaginary, go and see these places, because it helps.
Yeah, it's really important for me as well, because setting is really important in my writing. Everything I do is set in Perthshire, which is a bit of a problem because I live in Yorkshire. Even before the pandemic, it was a bit of a problem. Google Maps is great, but it does have some limitations. What I'm writing at the moment, for example, is based in the grounds of the Monee estate just outside Crieff. And there aren't any roads in the Monee estate, so Google Maps has never been there. So I'm having to try and go back to when I was a 13 and 14-year-old, cycling around Crieff in the summer holidays and trying to remember what the damn place looks like. My first novel, Cuddy Strip, is also set in a real place. The Cuddy Strip it's a strip of land just outside Perth, between the Dunning Road in Perth and Buckie Braes. And this is where the crimes in the novel happened. And it's still exactly the same today. I've seen the police photographs from the crime scene, and it looks exactly the same. So I was able to go there and kind of immerse myself in it and try and get some of the atmosphere. And the actual crime happened on the 14th of August, 1935, and it happened about 10 o'clock at night. And so back in 2017, when I was writing the book, I was in Perth on the anniversary, and I was determined that I was going to go to the strip at the time it happened, I was going to be on the Cuddy Strip at 10 o'clock on the anniversary of when the crimes happened. But the thing was, in 1935, the 14th of August was a full moon, and it'd been a beautiful sunshiny day. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. So at 10 o'clock at night, it was probably still nice and bright. When I went, it had been raining for about 3 or 4 days. I'd been on the strip that afternoon, and it was a bit of a quagmire. And it was still raining 10 o'clock at night, well, 9:30 at night. It was still raining, and it was really miserable. It was pitch black. And I had a bottle of wine cooling in the sink in my hotel room, and there was a film on the telly, and basically I just chickened out. But that aside, yeah, I do think it's really helpful to go and visit your places and see the things that have happened and try and build your stories around that.
Yeah, I completely agree with both Linda and Rob about that. I was lucky enough that my novel is set in Edinburgh and near Edinburgh in the Pentland area. And I live in Edinburgh, so I was able, I knew it well anyway, but to go very much with the novel in my mind was important. And of course, Edinburgh, you know, you walk down the closes and you could be in the 17th century some of the time. So that's really helpful for trying to get the atmosphere. The Pentland area, a lot of it's disappeared, and things like IKEA have appeared where I'm trying to imagine the 17th century. But there is still the ruined kirk in which Jonnet had to appear in sackcloth every week. And of course, as well as place for me, there is also the actual object of the sackcloth that Jonnet was forced to wear, which was where the story started for me when I found out about that and did some research into it. And that is on display in the museum, the National Museum of Scotland. So as well as being able to go to places, to actually go and see the object itself and have that direct link with my character through several centuries was a really helpful and powerful thing to do. Maybe a bit like Bishop Wishart's tomb, you know, just that connection with the person.
Yeah, that kind of ties into the next question. Lucy's asked, how would you suggest someone wanting to write a historical novel begins the research process?
How do you suggest it?
Well, for me, as I said earlier, the story came about completely by accident. I just happened to see a picture of the funeral of the murdered boy on the Cuddy Strip, and I started researching it that way. So I guess one thing you can do is get a story in mind, and it may be just something like that, just serendipitous like that. Or as Flora's done, go to the museums, look at some of the artifacts in there and just see what there is. But I think another really great way of doing it for me is just looking at some of the old newspapers, because I spend a lot of time looking at the old newspapers from the 1930s. And some of the stories in them are just remarkable. They had such a casual kind of approach to death back then. You know, there were just hundreds, if not thousands, of people died in car accidents every week, children dying in hideous accidents, and they were just kind of reported in this really kind of casual way. And you just imagine what it'd be like nowadays, the blanket headlines, but they didn't. But there are some just remarkable stories, and I find I keep putting a lot of those stories into my work, just as sort of background stuff, because they're so interesting. And I think I would really recommend that. Just look at some of the old newspapers, go down to your local library, look at the back copies of your local newspapers. They're absolutely fascinating.
I would say pick something you're interested in. I know it sounds very trite, but pick characters and pick a period you're interested in, because it'll be less. You don't want to be the top of writing a book's difficult enough when it's something you enjoy, but when it's something that you don't enjoy, or you haven't got an interest in, or a glimpse of admiration or even disdain for, it's you should pick something that you're interested in an area or a topic, or you know, something that will just give you that extra motivation, and you'll find the research not quite as torturous. And I found sometimes I'd connect to things and not expect it, and it's serendipity. You know, you find you're looking at something, and then you find that there's a character in another part of the world who just happens to connect with the character you're looking at, and then you can start sort of connecting people up. And I found that quite interesting. So serendipity does actually what is true. And then you'll, as I said, I picked a few people that I know. I said, oh yeah, that happened. That's just like that so-and-so guy I used to know, that so-and-so work girl. So, you know, you can tie your interest with your, you know, your research, and then you can pick some characters that are like people that you know, and that you start getting a theme, and you start getting connections, and you can start weaving a story around it. And also desk research. I mean, you know, I know Hilary Mantel used to write, and you know, all her stuff was, you know, where was Cromwell such and such a date, and where was Queen Anne Boleyn and such. So she did a huge amount of research. I did a lot, but some of it, you know, I didn't go to that degree of detail. But it's good that you've got some credibility behind your book in terms of dates and personalities, and it's not just, you know, all supposition. It's, and I found that easy to help me write a story, as though, you know, I used some foundations and key dates to be able to drive what I was doing.
Yeah,
so some facts.
I think that is something that helps us as historical writers. I think you referred to that earlier, Linda, when you were giving your introduction about how we're taking our fictional imagination bits, but we've got this structure and these dates and events already to plot them against, and see how our imaginary characters or our versions of real characters react to the historical events. So I think that's actually I think that's much easier. I think it'd be really hard to start with a blank piece of paper and try and dream it all up out of my head. So yeah, I would just agree with what you've said, and find something, a period, a person, something that catches your imagination, and start exploring, and you can see where it goes, because it will probably take you places you didn't expect.
True.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I think we're going to finish off the panel session there. So thanks again to all of our panelists, Flora Johnston, Rob McInroy, and of course Linda Kristiansen. And make sure you pick up a copy of What You Call Free, Cuddy Strip, and of course Raised Dragon if you haven't already. You can get a copy at on the Ringwood website, where you can get priority shipping, and you can also get it on Amazon or at your local bookstore if you ask them to order it in for you. If you haven't had enough of the discussions about Scottish historical fiction, and we are having another event in person in Edinburgh on the 15th of November at the Beehive Inn. So you can hear more of a conversation from both Linda and Flora there. It's sure to be a great night, so make sure you look out for information about that on the website or the Facebook page. I'd like to once again thank everybody that's been involved tonight. So our two readers, Janie Monroe and Paul Ryan, thanks so much for bringing parts of the novel to life tonight, and hopefully helping everyone get a bit of a taste for it. And obviously our panelists, Flora Johnston, Rob McInroy, and of course Linda Kristiansen, thanks for letting me bombard you with questions. And I'd also like to say thank you to Ailey Harrower, who's done all the behind the scenes things and the technical side tonight, so I didn't have to worry about it. That's a brilliant help. And once again, I'd just like to encourage you all to pick up a copy of Raised Dragon from the Ringwood website or the other places I mentioned. And thanks everyone for coming along tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.